Buonasera a tutti. Good evening, everybody. I'm happy to introduce the lecture, one of our last lectures of the semester, with Icelandic designer and artist Brynjar Sigurðarson. It's part of this series of lectures, workshops that's been happening in Fabrica since the beginning of March under the theme of archaism. And we are very happy to have been working together with Brynjar and Veronika these last 3 days, where our residents or artists in residence have been developing and working together on their own research, and also developing a kind of exercises or developments of their works with Brynjar. And before I start the lecture, and then we will have maybe a bit of a questions afterwards, I wanted to have a little introduction of Brynjar's and Veronika's studio to introduce the work, and then I will pass the word to Brynjar to start the lecture. No? Brynjar Sigurðarson received a master's degree in product design from ECAL in Lausanne, and a bachelor degree from the Iceland Academy of the Arts in Reykjavik. Currently, with his partner Veronika Sedlmair, they're creating the studio Brynjar and Veronika, who are working on various projects ranging from furniture, accessories, performance-related projects, as well as self-produced objects that they've been distributing under the company they call Society of Things. Since 2011, the studio has been creating a body of work driven from the theatrical and natural references, linking anthropology, geology, and storytelling. And they've been using various media such as drawings, photography, video, sound, and objects, trying to convey new works and also a kind of a new attitude to narrative, and by the way of creating also new myths. The studio has been working on various projects. Hopefully Brynjar will elucidate some of them, but I mentioned the Silent Village, which was a furniture collection for Galerie Kreo in Paris. Another object that I recall is the circle flute, which was a circular flute that was supported by Lafayette Anticipations in Paris, and that was also used by Björk during his Cornucopia tour recently. And also they've developed through the studio a lot of projects with companies like Swarovski, Camper, Sirva, the manufacturer of Sèvres, PCM, Spark Design Space, and of course a collection for Thomas Eich. Some of the works have been exhibited and presented in exhibitions around the world, and especially we witnessed and we saw some of the films that they've been doing, like Brynjar Sigurðarson also, that was produced by Frosty Knorr, was presented at the Art Film Festival in Den Haag in Holland. And now it's part of the permanent collection of the MAC in Vienna. In 2011, he received the Grand Prix of the Design Parade in Villanois, in Hyères, in France. In 2015, he was awarded with the Swiss Design Award, as well as the honorable mention at the Hublot Design Prize. And the studio has received also the Swiss Design Awards. The Swarovski Designers of the Future were in Design Miami, in Basel. And of course, the Hublot Design Prize in 2018, and of course the Nordic Thorsten and Vanja Sternberg Prize in Norway. Just to name a few of the collections or museums that have been participating: the Design Museum in Helsinki, the Röhsska Museum in Gothenburg, the Hafnarborg in Iceland, and the Norwegian biennale in Moss, and also in Arles, in the Archaeological Museum and Atelier Luma. There's some very interesting projects happening that he mentioned about some research and glass. Hopefully we'll see some of that, and also a lot of new objects for Galerie Kreo in Paris, and public installation in Ornamenta 24 in Pforzheim in Germany. Just to be brief, I really thank you for coming. Thank you, Veronika, for being here and participating in this sort of adventure with the artists in residence here. And let's welcome Brynjar and Veronika to Fabrica. Thank you very much.
Hello. Thank you so much, Carlos, for this extravagant introduction. It sounds much better than it is somehow. So I will tell you a few of my projects. I will try to explain a little bit how we work and what kind of our values in the studio are. We start here. Let me see, view. So I'm from Iceland, and the first project I will tell you about is in my third year in my bachelor in Iceland. I'm 23 years old, or 22, and I had gotten very fed up with being at school all the time and coming up with ideas inside the building somehow, so I decided to leave Reykjavik and get as far away from my hometown as possible, which led me to this place, Vopnafjörður. It's a relatively small fishing village in the northeast of Iceland. It's around 600 people that live there. And I arrived there in February. In February, northeast of Iceland is cold and dark and a little bit unpredictable. And basically, I went there without any predefined ideas of what I wanted to do. All I did was just to try to be kind of naively interested in my surroundings and get a bit of a, a glimpse of the atmosphere of the place. I show you here a few photos. I would visit farmers in distant valleys. I would hang out at the harbor where they were bringing in fish. I would visit ateliers or kind of working spaces of fishermen, hang out with the cows. And slowly, throughout the course of 1 month, I started to somehow connect to this place. Also, when you're alone, in the middle of nowhere, you start to, I was a lot alone, kind of somewhere in the middle of nature. And when you're alone in nature, I would start to kind of imagine supernatural things. For example, I had a cap that I lost during the trip, and I was completely convinced that a ghost had taken my cap until I found it under my bed the last day. And then, after a few weeks, I meet this guy, Hreinn Bernhardsson. He is a shark hunter and a fisherman. Here he is holding a kind of a piece of shark meat that they ferment and eat as a delicacy. And he invited me to his workshop, which you see here. He was preparing these nets here in the back for a 100-day lumpfish season. There's a special season during February and March where you're able to fish a specific type of fish, and he was preparing nets for this season. And he would teach me to use this tool here on the left side of the picture. It's a netting needle. And basically it's used to connect together nets, to bind them kind of together. And I would spend around a week playing with this tool and sort of kind of trying to figure out what this workshop was somehow telling me. And I realized that if I use this tool in a certain way, it has an aesthetic value, not only functional, but there is also something beautiful about it. And then I arrive in Reykjavik, and my role, what I felt there was that I should try to translate the atmosphere of this place into the shape of objects. So this is in 2009. This is my diploma project from Iceland, where I kind of create these abstract structures, and I start decorating the structures. 2 years later, I start focusing even more on the decoration as a language. And for me here, it's starting to become almost like an obsession. For example, you see here on the left side, I use a very thin nylon fishing string that I loop again and again with this netting needle, and slowly it becomes a sort of a transparent skin around the sticks. And for me, it's becoming a bit of a visual language speaking or visual vocabulary speaking the language of the Icelandic harbor environment. So I see myself a bit as a translator. I don't translate into words, but into details and objects. The diploma project from Iceland then becomes an exhibition for Galerie Kreo in Paris. And here the objects are maybe relatively abstract, but they have functions, so furnitures. And here you see an entrance table, and these details are still sort of evolving. And this is a bit how I work. Every time an order is made at the gallery, they build the wooden structures, and then I meet these structures, and I lay out kind of a buffet of stuff that I gather, and I start asking these structures, what do they want from me? How can I somehow give them something? How can I tell a story through the details and the decoration? Here you see a coat hanger and a long library table. And a side table. Then, a few years later, when Veronika and I are working together already, I'm invited back to Vatnafjörður. So the town invites us to come and work on a series of installations in and around the town. So it was very special. Here kind of the tables had turned. I was not sort of taking inspiration from the place in a way, but I was giving something back. And when you are there, here we are visiting in December. When you are there, the elements are really present. It's, it's kind of all about the weather. There is the sea, which is often very rough. It's very windy almost all the time. And during the winter, you have, this is the brightest it gets. So kind of sunrise and sunset merges into one moment. You see the sun kind of rise above the mountain on the other side of the fjord for 15 minutes, and then it sort of disappears and appears again half an hour later between two mountains for 2 minutes. And we somehow found both these moments very inspiring, and also the elements. So our idea was maybe we can work with the elements to activate installations. Our first idea was to create a sort of a bell choir, so a group of bells that would be floating around in the sea. Here you see, this is kind of a rendering. And the idea would be that these bells would be floating on the surface of the sea, and you would hear this clinging sound when the sea was moving. Here, Veronika is trying out the first test. Another test was to look at a mountain on the other side of the fjord. Around 30 years ago, locals found gold in this mountain, and since then they have never found gold again. So our idea was to place small mirrors in the hills of the mountain that would reflect the evening sunlight. Let me see, this way. And we spent, this is the second time we are there, and we spent around a week, and it was completely cloudy the whole time until the last evening, when finally there is sun, and Veronika drives all the way to the other side. It's around half an hour, and then brings this small IKEA mirror and tries to reflect the sunlight at us in the town. And here you see these sort of glimpses. So I'm standing at the harbor. We did many other tests. We had kind of maybe around 5 ideas that we would continuously test. We would make models and see how it would speak to us. And the last idea is here. It was almost a bit stupid, but we wanted to place a giant prism that would project the rainbow onto the mountain when the light would hit through it. Unfortunately, these ideas kind of didn't become reality because of budget reasons, but I will revisit some of these things later in the lecture. Then in 2015, we are in the supermarket in Iceland. It's my favorite supermarket, Krónan, and we were buying flatbread. This is kind of a Icelandic type of raw bread. I really like these flatbreads from Selfoss. Normally you get 5 in a pack, but here you get only 4, but I still buy it because it's so tasty. And most people in Iceland eat it with smoked lamb meat, but I like it with hummus. And when we were in the supermarket, we get a phone call from Lafayette Anticipations. It's an art foundation and a fund in Paris. And they invite us to do a residency that they support. What you have in Paris is not fishing. It's maybe for us, what was very impressive was like this tradition for performance arts, ballet, opera, music, and so on. They've been doing this for longer than, basically they were doing this while we were doing this in Iceland. There is it's like integrated in their blood almost. And therefore it felt very inviting to enter this domain, kind of the domain of performance arts. Maybe we could create an object or something that would enhance, that a performer would use, something that would create a sound or affect their movements. And during that time, this sketch pops up. It was very random. There was no kind of clear concept or anything. And it somehow just lays in a drawer for a few weeks, and it always keeps on kind of knocking on our doors, like, hey, I want attention. Have a look at me. So finally we say, okay, let's see if this somehow makes sense. Basically, what we see here is like 4 people playing in a circle, some sort of a circular flute for one listener in the center of the flute. So we go and test this at a music school in Paris. We ask for flute students during the lunch break to play for us in a circle. And this is maybe, here you see I'm very excited. This is kind of the moment when we realize there is something special about this idea. It was kind of peculiar and special to be in the center with these 4 flutes playing towards you. So we start looking for somebody that can build a flute. In Europe, it's very hard to find flute makers. It's kind of a dying species here. Most of it is produced in Japan and by Yamaha, for example. But this guy, Jean-Yves Rosen, in north of Paris, he was up for the challenge. And that's really when the sort of design process starts. We realize, okay, we want to make a circular flute. We want it to be a new instrument. We want it to be something more than just an artwork. People should be able to play it. And we also realize we know nothing about flute. None of us have ever played the flute. So we had to find people that could somehow bring something to the table. One thing that we also realize is that if we make a flute, we also need people to play the flute. So we start looking for flutists. We visit flutists in Berlin and in Holland until we finally find this guy here on the left, Michael Schmidt, an amazing contemporary flutist that we met in the train station for a coffee in Brussels. And somehow it was an instant connection. He also knows a special breathing and playing technique that's called circular breathing. So he is able to play a note continuously, more or less forever, without stopping to take to breathe in. And he knew about 3 other people in Europe that knew this technique, and we were lucky enough that he convinced all of them. Marike from Holland, Bettina from Switzerland, and Björk from Norway. And we start meeting them on Skype, sort of trying to convince them to participate in this project. And during the same time, the flute is in development. Here, what we are more or less doing is kind of stepping back, being on the sidelines. We would bring Michael Schmidt, the flutist, to the flute maker in Paris and say, okay, could you maybe speak together about some technical things? How could this become, how could this instrument become special? And they would speak for 3 hours, and we wouldn't really be a part of that. We just had to make sure that that the flute would stay circular, not end up in a square, something like that. But other than that, our role was more to just maintain the vision and bring together the right people. Then, half a year later, we meet the flute for the first time. It's around 16 parts that fit together into 8 meters of continuous flute. It's around 2.5 meters diameter. And there are a few things maybe that are kind of technically interesting to us. The flute maker worked on special connections that you see, for example, here, that allow you to push this key here that opens these valves. It's sort of a ball joint. So there kind of the techie designer was kind of fed. And we bring the flute to Iceland, where we invite the whole group of flutists and a composer to this town. This is not Vopnafjörður. This is on the other side of the island. It's called Flateyri in the Westfjords, and here only 200 people live during the summer and around 60 in the winter. And we invite the whole group where they stay in this town for 10 days, and they meet the flute for the first time. We would spend our days in this house. It's the clubhouse of the town. Here people watch cinema, theater, play snooker, have political meetings. Everything happens in this house, and we were fortunate to borrow it for 10 days, where the group of flutists and the composer would experiment with the flute. Here, our role is maybe to listen to what is being played, but also we are more or less just cooking all the time. We are bringing them cookies and coffee to keep them energized, and they are playing the flute. it was very intense, these 10 days. They would play around 10 hours a day and get to know this new instrument. Both try to see what kind of sound it can produce, but also just how it feels for them as flutists. These are kind of people that have spent their whole life alone with their instrument. It's always them and their instrument. It's very kind of individual practice, but suddenly here you are only a quarter of it. You're part of a community that comes together in order to play the flute. You cannot play it alone or 2 or 3. You have to be 4 in order to play it fully. And out of this workshop, they started to create a sort of acoustic or acoustic vocabulary that they would use in exhibitions in the future. It was very interesting for us that somehow suddenly we were taking part in kind of conversations with these modern classical music people that that somehow are from a field that's totally different from ours, but it was very special because you realize you all more or less speak the same language. I was somehow afraid that we would not be able to kind of understand each other's ideas, but it was a nice moment to realize that. Now I show you another video. Here you can hear some of the things that the flute offers. It can create a sort of a set of overtones if you close all the valves. And we would bring this material, the flute, and the flutists to Paris, where it was exhibited and performed on in an exhibition by Lafayette Anticipations for 2 weeks, and the public could enter and leave the flute at will during the performances. Each performance was around maybe between 15 and 40 minutes. And the flutist would improvise using this material that we had created. Being inside the flute when the flutists are playing it is sort of a special place. It's almost a bit therapeutic. You're kind of, it's kind of physical almost, because there are 4 sound waves that are hitting you. When they play a certain material, it almost feels like you're kind of lifting up, and sometimes it's maybe very intimidating. They are all kind of facing you, but it also can be kind of embracing. Where, for example, during these 2 weeks, people that would come, there was this woman there that came every single day. She somehow got addicted to be played at. It was also a very special moment when Jean-Yves Rosen, the flute maker, heard the flute for the first time. His atelier in Paris was too small to be able to construct the whole circular flute. So he had never seen the flute complete or heard it being played at by flutists. So this sort of very pragmatic man, like we were, for example, when he finished the flute, we were almost a bit emotional, thanking him for doing this work, and he was like, yeah, no problem, it's just a flute. I've done many flutes in the past, but then when he realizes that somehow, realizes what you can create with it, it was a nice moment for us to also observe. Since then, the flute has been traveling. Here it is in a flute convention in Paris, where hundreds of flute nerds come together and speak about flute, and we are kind of explaining the technical aspects of it. Þráinn Hjálmarsson, the composer that worked with us, he has written articles about what it offers in music magazines, and we worked with him further on pieces around the flute. Here is a score for a chamber opera for the circle flute and other objects, where it was performed in the National Archives in Paris. Here in the back you see Þráinn holding a blanket, and this blanket is full of small bells, and these bells are kind of heavy, so the blanket is heavy, and they hold up the blanket in front of the performer. But because the blanket is heavy, the one that's holding the blanket starts kind of shaking. And this shaking creates this sort of a sound which is a backdrop for the vocalist. Here you see it in the space. Later on, it was discovered by Björk, and she has been using it in her concerts for the last 4 years, I think. It's a concert series, a very ambitious concert series called Cornucopia, and in the middle of the concert, the flute is levitated from the ceiling around Björk, and she sings a song called Body Memory inside of it. So somehow this very almost naive rough sketch became so much bigger just because we listened to the small voice within us. And it was also a kind of a big teacher for us, this project, because you kind of realize there is this idea, but I have to more or less serve the idea to become the best it can be. It's not about me controlling what it's about. It's about trying to nurture it and trying maybe to find sometimes the right people to execute the things that you are not able to do. Then, not long ago, we were brought to another place, not Vatnafjörður, not Paris, but Pforzheim. It's a small city near Black Forest in Germany, and here you see kind of an aerial view of the city. To be honest, it's not a very pretty city, basically because of a bit of a sad story. There was 3 hours before the Second World War ended, the city was completely untouched, but in these last 3 hours of the war, it was completely destroyed. And what we found beautiful, the most beautiful part in the city was this river to us. It's kind of a natural park that runs through the town from west to east, meaning it runs more or less from sunset to sunrise, and you get this deep kind of sunlight in the evening and in the morning. And with sun and water, you get a rainbow. So that was kind of our idea. Could we create an installation that would be activated by the sunlight to create a rainbow? So we started testing. This is our first test outside our home. spraying water in the air and seeing if when the sun hits the water, if you see a rainbow. Also, we started to try to learn kind of about things. For example, the bigger the raindrop, the stronger the rainbow. We would go to the car washing workshop in our town and spray water in the air, and slowly kind of these tests became bigger and bigger. Here we asked the cleaners of Pforzheim to come and blow water in the air. And that was maybe when we realized that there was something, that it worked somehow. I will show you here. So basically, this is was the biggest test that we have, is the biggest test we have done so far, and there is a guy hiding behind the bush that's spraying water into the air, and we are standing on a bridge nearby, and the sun is behind us. And when you are midway between rain, water, and sun, you should be able to see a rainbow. Here we kind of realized that this idea could maybe be feasible. And like with the circular flute, when we had the circular flute, we realized we need somebody to play the flute. Here we realized we need someone to spray the water or something. There needs to be some sort of an object that sprays the water into the air. And in Icelandic folklore, a rainbow is the bridge between elves and humans. So our thought was maybe we create a sort of a elf or elf spirit that would spray water into the air, kind of as the rainbow maker. And he would be placed here midway between these two bridges. So here on this bridge you would see the rainbow in the evening and this bridge in the morning. And this spirit somehow is slowly coming alive. So this is a project in progress. And we've been somehow trying to get in touch with the spirit, either something kind of floral or something a little bit more, maybe a little bit more dark. We find that also maybe interesting, that there is something almost scary that's spraying out this water to create this beautiful kind of natural phenomena. And in exactly 1 year, it should be ready. It's going to be presented as part of a cultural festival called Ornamenta next year. Now, I want to tell you a bit about Sirva. It's a glass research center in Marseille. So we don't always work with this sort of site-specific approach. We also really like working with materials. And Sirva is sort of a magical place, to be honest. It's state-funded, which allows it to kind of have no commercial constraints. And they invite artists for residencies that sometimes stay for a few years, but you come there 1 week at a time, every 6 months or so, and you work with their team. I have a bit of a past with them. I worked on a very short residency on these pieces in 2011, where I worked with a certain kind of a special glass method called pâte de verre, which is not glass blowing. You're working kind of with it almost like it's more a chemical process, and you cook it in a kiln. And here the idea was to display kind of the spectrum of the glass from a very transparent, more common glass into something that looks almost like a stone or a mineral. Then 9 years later, we are back in Sirva and for kind of a real residency. And it felt very inviting to enter this, to kind of to keep on the project where we left it in 2011. We had the idea of maybe working, or the kind of question was pâte de verre. The problem in Europe, you're not able to find any colored glass for pâte de verre because it's almost a non-existing method. It was very popular in the beginning of 19th century during Art Nouveau. And then it more or less disappeared because it's very time-consuming. So us realizing that we don't have any access to colored glass meant that we had to make our own glass colors. So for the first 2 years, we spent almost all our time working on colors. And for 6 months, this is how our tests looked like. It was completely terrible. Everything was more or less black. And slowly we sort of started to learn with the glass technicians at Sirva how to kind of mix things and the temperature we needed to use and so on, until eventually we had around 1,000 new colors, sort of a color archive. Some colors are transparent, others are opaque, some are kind of like minerals or stones, and others look like jelly or plastic. And with these colors, we started to make kind of drawings. This is more or less how our work looks like. It's a lot of recipes that we are somehow calculating and mixing here inside this space. Here you see Veronika and Valerie, the technician. And this is how the glass looks like. It's kind of powders that we mix together in certain ratios, and then we cook them in a kiln. We are starting to learn a bit about how the glass sort of flows together, what sort of colors are friends and what sort of colors are not friends. For example, here on this left picture, you see this sort of dark patches. This is because the yellow glass and the transparent glass and the blue, they oxidize when they meet each other. So you get this kind of metallic border. While here on these tests, you see how kind of they mix together. And slowly we start to learn about this method. Here, for example, this is the same piece. So this is how it looks before, and you have to really just more or less guess what is going to happen. You do something, and then the glass and the kiln does something else, and something new comes out of it. And this is the idea, that it will be a new type of stained glass windows. Normally, stained glass is made out of kind of many small pieces that are glued together, or they paint directly on the glass, but our idea is that you have these multicolored glass panels in one solid piece of glass. And yeah. Here it's a lot about the transparency, so it's about the light that travels through. So here you see it's a small model, maybe this big. And the glass looks very different from when the light comes on top of it or when the light goes through it. For example, this test we find, yeah, almost a little bit ugly. It looks somehow like wool or something, but then when the light comes through it, it looks very kind of magical or like some sort of a universe that you want to dive into. And at the moment we are looking for sponsoring to allow us to make larger windows. So our idea is that these windows can be as big as the kiln, which is maybe around 2-3 meters high. These projects maybe make you think that everything is under control, that we have everything figured out, but it's really not. Most of the things we do are messy and a bit chaotic. We spend a lot of time just doing management stuff, writing emails, and trying to find time for us to work on our own things. I also really like just drawing. When I can, I spend a few days a month doing drawing. I also got this electric piano a few months ago that I love playing. Then the next day I am really into doing photographs. And I say, maybe I should do something with my photos, and I work on a magazine with those photographs, and the next day I'm like, I want to get into 3D. So I spent a year learning this 3D program and working on kind of three-dimensional sculptural things. And somehow then I forget about that, and I think, maybe I can do a mural. Like maybe I will put these drawings on a wall in color. And it's very random somehow. I'm just pulled from one thing to another. And then I think, maybe I don't do it in color. Maybe it's without color and has somehow three-dimensionality to it. And that ends up being smaller reliefs, not a big wall. And then we find ourselves doing furniture for a home, and I think maybe I put a small dinosaur on a stick, or or I do this broom that is a flute as well, like a flute broom, and it's a bit of a chaos, to be honest. Here we are doing a kind of a mass-produced light, so something so different from these artistic sketches that we do. But then somehow you see that this big soup of random stuff together forms maybe a little universe that somehow speaks together. The 3D sketches I spent a year in 2019 doing, they somehow influenced the sculpture for the rainbow, and all these drawings somehow find their place in these windows, and eventually things somehow make sense in its weirdness. Yeah, thank you. Questions? Or
if there are any questions?
Yeah. Needless to say, like authorship has been like a great deal for artists through art history, etc. But you have a very interesting take on it that I think allows space for collaboration and for the collective to be part of the artwork. And I would like to know a little bit more on your perspective on it, if you feel like a film director of sorts or orchestra composer when you work with this many people in the same process.
Maybe more like a farmer or something like that. You have to grow wheat, and you need, then you realize, okay, I need to water it this much, and I need this much sun to grow the wheat. But if you want to grow asparagus, maybe you need a totally different thing. So yeah, maybe more like a farmer. But also, I mean, like I said there in the end, most of the time I'm just in my studio somehow, living a bit of a mundane everyday life, you know, trying to keep myself going, and then you have these ideas and slowly you try to somehow either bring them forward, or you are lucky enough to have somebody that says, that sort of believes in what you do and makes things easier for you. But yeah, maybe I am also a bit like sometimes pragmatic. I try to find a pragmatic way to realize maybe these more kind of abstract ideas, and maybe that when these two things come together, you're able to realize it. Yeah, I don't know if I'm answering your question well, but yeah.
Oh, no, you are. Thank you.
Thank you for lecture, and I saw lots of interesting projects that you did it, and I'm quite curious about what is your favorite art project that you did it. Can I ask you?
What's my favorite project? I don't know, often when you look back, you become a bit nostalgic about projects that you did, you know? But in the moment when you're doing them, maybe they don't feel like your favorite project. But the circle flute, that was kind of a really nice experience for us to work with all these amazing people and somehow, you know, see this idea come to reality. So yeah, I think that was one of our favorite things to do.
Any other questions, Jay?
Thanks. This might be like too long of a question to answer, or maybe it's too short of a question to answer, but I was kind of curious what role, if you want to call it spirituality, call it that, but this kind of belief that you have that these things are all like interconnected, sort of has on your work, and if you ever, I don't know, draw from like Icelandic like mythology, or because some of these things are like I don't know, the mirror thing reminds me of the Greek story of like when they're shining the mirror on the boat and it like burns down, or yeah, I'm just curious where these things kind of live, if anywhere, outside of your everyday kind of experience, or if you have a name for it.
Yeah, at least for us, like, at least for me, like I really try to not judge the ideas that come to me, you know. The moment I start to kind of try to, yeah, judge them or say this idea is good and this idea is not good, I think then I'm not doing the right thing. I see myself maybe more as just a medium where things come through me, and some things will be good, some things will be bad. That's kind of part of the process. So maybe that's kind of, when I manage to get in that space, that I'm kind of okay with, yeah, also what just others think or something like that, I think then that feels kind of right. But yeah, I'm also very inspired by Iceland and yeah, everything that, yeah, how I'm connected to Iceland. Maybe also because I move away from Iceland during my studies. I go to Lausanne to finish my master. So I've never kind of, I've been away for 14 years, you know, and since I left Iceland, I started to look a lot back and kind of, you also, before I didn't know anything except Iceland, and then suddenly I'm in Switzerland and I realized, this is weird. You know, there is something peculiar here in Iceland that you don't find maybe in Europe. Not just the landscape or the nature, but also traditions and folklores and all these things. Like, I don't know, it's a cliche, but it's somehow true as well, like with elves, or we call it huldufolk, it's kind of the hidden people. Like we allow it just to kind of be, you know, like it's not, nobody is really saying it doesn't exist, but there's also nobody kind of yelling, I've seen 10 elves yesterday in my backyard, you know. It's just, it's okay if you believe it or not, you know, but at the same time you don't pee on a rock because elves live in some rocks. So yeah, there's kind of things like that.
Amazing. Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you for this presentation. It's a follow-up question because you were also saying that, for example, the naive drawing was kind of like coming back to you and talking to you, or like when you were talking about the table that you did in the first gallery in France, that you put everything on the table with the materials and then like they start talking to you. And my question would be, what role does intuition play? Because of course it's a lot of research behind your work, but still there's like this element of intuition, or like this maybe very genuine dialogue that you start with the materials. So how are they connecting to one another, if it's explainable in a way?
It is maybe less mysterious than, you know, it's talking to me and then I'm okay, I put this here, you know. It's more maybe just trusting that somehow what feels right kind of is right somehow. But yeah, when I do these details, I'm also very uncertain, like, is this enough or not? And I go and have a cup of coffee and I come back and I take something away, and but I also believe, like, when kind of maybe our biggest role is just to try to be in a good space with ourselves somehow, and at least for me, when I'm in a good space, when I do my things, when I eat well or meditate or do sports, I'm more likely kind of to be in a flow, you know, and then I'm maybe more likely to bring things out more effortlessly. But sometimes it's very important also to be in kind of a complete, in the opposite energy and see what comes out of that.
Thank you.
I had a more down-to-earth question about how do you organize your work with Veronika, how you started to work together, and how you really organize your working days. Does it look more like design tandem or more art? And how do you put maybe boundaries? How do you split ideas? How do you find compromise? Thank you.
It's kind of a constant changing thing. Like I had years, maybe before we met, like I was very disciplined, like I was every day at 9, but then like just work, there was nothing else in my life than work. And then after the two of us met, Veronika taught me to be a bit more soft and allow things to come and not rush to the studio at 9 in the morning, sometimes just arrive at 11 or something. And then maybe for the last few years, it's maybe more me at the studio, and Veronika comes in from time to time to kind of speak about ideas. So it's not back to where we were before, but where it was before we met, but kind of we've maybe found some sort of a balance where I'm more the worker, I work on the ideas and so on, and then Veronika comes in and kind of sprinkles her magic dust over things. Yeah, but then I'm also really into making lists. I'm kind of a list fanatic. That keeps me organized and kind of, how I manage myself. Like when you learn, now it's been, 12 years kind of working independent. It's a lot about self-motivation, to tap yourself on the back, you know. And kind of finding this balance between organization and also allowing yourself to go for something you're excited about, although maybe it's better to send these emails first, you know. So yeah, it's a constant kind of dance.
So is there any other question to close? If not, maybe I'm interested to, we saw during these days also a film that you did, which also was quite an interesting way. One of the things that I find fascinating about your practice is the freedom that the disciplines allow themselves to mingle, you know, between film, between a little bit connections to anthropology, ethnography, and I wonder when you start working on a project, when you do the research part, do you already sense the output? How is it going to be, or do you think that, as you were mentioning before, you allowed the elements to start talking and take shape, and then learn how to become a filmmaker or learn how to become a musician, no? Which, for me, that's a very interesting way of understanding, no, your practice.
Yeah, it's funny you say it. Like, I think, I try not to have a preconceived idea of how things will look like in the end. I try to kind of allow it to grow, and then things often, like the most surprising things come up. But it's maybe a bit of an Icelandic attitude as well, because like, it's somehow, if you're living in a small community, like, you cannot just, you have to know how to do your things. It's a bit like the farmer, you know. He has to be a mechanic. He has to be very physical, kind of bringing the hay. He has to know about biology and agriculture, but he is also maybe kind of a psychologist for animals, and also kind of needs to know a bit, I don't know, to put pain medicine in the sheep that is suffering. It also needs to kind of receive the lambs when they are being born. So you need to be able to do a lot of things. It's also in Reykjavik, like, everybody are kind of musicians. And it's not because you studied classical guitar for 10 years that you can be a musician. It's just, you just do it, you know. You do what you have to do in order to somehow, for me, create these projects. And then sometimes it's maybe a complete mess, and you learn as you go, this learning through doing. And sometimes maybe things come together.
Fantastic. So maybe if there is no other questions, I'm going to thank you, Brynjar, for your time, Veronika. And I also invite you for the next lecture that was happening on Monday with Elena Bizerna, who will be giving a lecture and talk. She's a writer and researcher, and she specialized in walking. So she's published 2 recent very important books about walking and the relation between walking and the art world, and artists who deal with the idea of walking as their main practice. So it's going to be also a nice adventure for next Monday. And I thank you again all for coming. And again, thanks Brynjar and Veronika for your fantastic time. Thank you.
Thank you.